Hello, I'm Taufik Eko from IEMBA12 Jakarta. I will present my thesis, Navigating Bank Liquidity in Indonesia Amidst COVID-19. The study explores the factors influencing bank liquidity and their shifts during the pandemic. Next, I will outline today's presentation. I will start with an introduction to bank liquidity in Indonesia and its current relevance. I will review existing literature, then explain the research methods. Then, I will discuss the result, finding, and conclude with a summary of key points and implications. Starting with the introduction, I will discuss bank liquidity in Indonesia, which sets the context for the presentation. The Asian financial crisis and the 2008 global financial crisis underscored the significance of liquidity in banking. This led to the Basel Committee introduction of Basel III standards, including the LCR and NSFR regulations, adopted by Indonesia's OJK. The LCR emphasized on liquidity by mandating more high-quality liquid assets, while the NSFR ensures balance between assets and liability maturity, thereby minimizing profitability impacting maturity transformation. During crises such as COVID-19, entities like government and central banks, including Bank Indonesia, implement measures to boost the economy. For instance, Bank Indonesia reduced its policy rates, influencing the yield of 10-year government bonds and bank rates. The Indonesian government responded by converting banks' primary reserve requirement into government bonds, making onshore banks and main holder of Indonesian rupiah government bonds. This increased ownerships affected by liquidity, which we'll explore in upcoming LCR and NSFR graph. The graph on the left displays the LCR, showing a rise in high-quality liquid assets implying enhanced bank stability. The right graph represents the NSFR, also on an upward trend, signifying a balance in asset and liability maturity, potentially affecting profitability. These graphs illustrate the management of liquidity by Indonesian banks, especially during crises like COVID-19. Based on the aforementioned background, the research questions of the study are: 1. How do internal factors like ROA, total assets, and NPL affect the liquidity of banks in Indonesia? How do external factors like real GDP, money supply, M2, affect bank liquidity? How has the relationship between these factors and bank liquidity changed before and during COVID-19 pandemic? What are the implications of this change on Indonesia's banking sector stability during the pandemic? These questions is the guide for our further discussion. The study has 4 objectives. Investigate the influence of internal factors like ROA, total assets, and NPL on Indonesian banks' liquidity. Examine the impact of external factors like real GDP and M2 on these banks' liquidity. Analyze how the relationship between these factors and bank liquidity has changed before and during the pandemic. Understand the implication of this change on Indonesia's banking sector stability during the pandemic. This objective will guide the discussion. The study is expected to contribute in several ways. It offers insights to researchers and banking professionals about liquidity management in Indonesian banking industry. It increases the understanding of factors affecting Indonesian banking liquidity during the COVID-19 pandemic. It serves as a reference for improving liquidity management, regulations, and enhancing financial stability. These contributions will not only benefit the academic community, but also practical implications for banking professionals and regulators. In the literature review section, I will mention prior studies and theories on bank liquidity and factors influencing it. Banks profit from interest margin between deposits and loans, being part of each depositor's reserve. They manage liquidity to satisfy depositors' needs, but with poor management can lead to liquidity and solvency risk. Liquidity risk stems from 2 sources: liability side related to deposits and asset side related to loans. To handle liquidity, the Indonesian Financial Service Authority, or OJK, adopted the LCR and NSFR from Basel III. The LCR, implemented since 2015, ensures banks can cover 30 days of stress scenarios. The NSFR, implemented since late 2017, encourages banks for funding over a year. These rules apply to banks based on their core capital. KBMI 4, 3, and foreign banks must report their LCR and NSFR positions to OJK and disclose them quarterly. The LCR and NSFR regulations can raise funding costs as banks might use more stable but pricier funding sources. This influences the gap between borrowing and lending rates. NSFR can cut profits when the cost of stable funding surpasses the deposit funding, while the LCR can cut profits when the return on HQLA is less than the deposit cost. The relationships between the borrowing and lending rates to LCR and NSFR differs with each bank characteristics and economic conditions. In these slides, I will discuss the internal factors affecting bank liquidity. The first one is total assets. Larger banks often have diversified portfolios, helping manage them from liquidity risk. The hypothesis is there is a positive link between total assets and bank liquidity. Return on assets, or ROA. ROA is a profitability stability ratio that can drop with high liquidity due to lower returns from liquid assets. The hypothesis there is a negative link between ROA and bank liquidity. The third one is non-performing loans, or NPL. With high NPL, banks can decrease its liquid assets, which cause them financial risk issues. The hypothesis is there is a negative link between NPL and bank liquidity. Next is the external factors that affect bank liquidity. The first one is real GDP. Strong GDP growth can boost loan demand, leading to higher banks' liquidity. On the other hand, low GDP recessions can reduce liquidity. Rising inflation rates can lower loan demand, leading to increased liquidity. The hypothesis there is a positive link between real GDP and bank liquidity. The second external factor is money supply M2. A rise in money supply enhances the bank's lending funds and economic activity. During economic downturn, reduced loan demand might shrink M2 and decrease liquidity. The hypothesis there is a positive link between M2 and bank liquidity. There are several works related to bank liquidity from outside and inside of Indonesia. Overall, the hypothesis is there is a change in associations between independent variables and dependent variables before and during the pandemic. Now, in the research method sections, I will outline the methodology, data collections, and analysis techniques, explaining how study is conducted and the findings is reached. In this section, I will discuss the data and sample used in the study. The secondary data was sourced from Indonesian banks' report, including LCR and NSFR reports from KBMI 4 and KBMI 3 banks, and quarterly financial reports for variables like ROA and total assets and NPL. Other variables like real GDP and money supply M2 were obtained from Bank Indonesia, and the research populations was banks registered in Indonesia from Q1 of 2015 to Q3 of 2023. Specifically, KBMI 4 and KBMI 3 banks required by OJK to report their LCR and NSFR, and reported their financial performance. In these sections, I will discuss the data analysis methods. The study used descriptive statistics for data characteristics and regression analysis to model the variables relationships, specifically multiple linear regressions. The study treats each bank samples as a system for analysis. The study has two system equations for the models, the LCR model and the NSFR model. These methods and models guided the research. The study used a comparison approach to analyze the situations before and during the COVID-19 pandemic, with Q2 of 2020 as a breakpoint. The regression output produced a p-value for each variable's coefficients, with values lower than 0.05 indicating a statistical significance, The R-squared values suggest that the total variation in independent variables explained by the independent variables. Wells coefficients test evaluates the overall significance of coefficients. A comparison is made between the coefficients and p-values as well as the R-squared values before and during the pandemic to understand the change in variables associations. Now, in the result and discussion section, I will discuss the result and analysis related to the research objective and hypothesis. I compare the LCR model before and during the pandemic. The table shows R-squared values from various banks. For instance, BBCA R-squares value increased from 0.1217 to 0.8244, while the BBNI decreased from 0.8167 to 0.695, so on and so forth. I also list the variables with their p-values from Wells coefficient test, with value less than 0.05 indicating a significance. The regression output and Wells coefficient test result shows changes in R-squared values. Hence, more variables significantly affecting the LCR during the pandemic. The unnecessary model was also compared before and during the pandemic. The table showed the R-squared values for various banks. For instance, the BBCA's R-squared values increased from 0.7040 to 0.7858, while the BBNI decreased from 0.7914 to 0.4736, so on and so forth. I also list the variables with their p-values with values less than 0.05 indicating significance. The regression output and Wells coefficient test results shows that there is indeed a change in R-squared values, hence more variables significantly affecting NSFR before the pandemic. This table shows the hypothesis, their significance, coefficients, and conclusions for LCR model before and during pandemic. For instance, the H1 hypothesis of positive associations between total assets and bank liquidity. This was unsupported before, but supported during the pandemic. H2. The hypothesis was a negative associations between ROA and bank liquidity, which was supported on both times. The table shows how variables associations with bank liquidity and changed during the pandemic. This is a table showing a hypothesis, their significance, coefficients, and conclusions for NSFR models before and during pandemic. For instance, the H1 hypothesis was a positive associations between total assets and bank liquidity. This was supported before but unsupported during the pandemic. H2, the hypothesis was a negative associations between ROA and bank's liquidity, which was unsupported on both times. The table shows how variables associations with bank's liquidity changed during the pandemic. Now we arrive at the conclusion. I will summarize the research finding, discuss their implication, and suggest a future research areas. Next, I conclude the study on the COVID-19 impacts on banks' liquidity in Indonesia. The study finds a significant pandemic influence on these banks' liquidity, affecting both internal and external factors' relationship with banks' liquidity. This finding provides an insight for theoretical advancement and practical action in banks' liquidity management, especially during extraordinary events like COVID-19 pandemics. However, other variables like exchange rates are not included in the study, which these variables could also be significant impact on liquidity. Future research could compare the situation in Indonesia with other countries to understand global trends in bank liquidity changes during the pandemic. Lastly, before concluding, I thank you all for your time and interest in my research on the COVID-19 impacts on banks' liquidity in Indonesia. I hope the insights from this study can contribute to managing bank liquidity, especially during extraordinary events like the COVID-19 pandemics. Thank you and goodbye.